Good morning, everybody. We are continuing our series on structure of Torah in historical context, and we are picking up where we left off after last video, which is to continue the discussion about Tanach, Torah, Nevi'im, and Kesuvim. Today we're going to get more into the detailed difference between these three types, so these three forms of the Torah Shebechsav. But first, we have to cover a hanging question from the last presentation that we made on this. And that is, we point out what the Gemara says in Megillah, that we had, 1,200,000 prophets, and that was at least the current information, at the time that statement that the Gemara is quoting was coined. It was minimally that much that prophets that we had. So much prophecy, and for reasons that we explained in the last installment of this series, only prophecies are what make it in the Torah Shebechsav. So a lot of prophecies. So why is only 24 books long, as we know it. So the Gemara, that same Gemara points out, says that the reason is Nevuah shotzcha lidoros nitan likasev, nevuah shalotzchados lo nitan likasev. Right, a nevuah, a prophecy that has a timeless message for all generations. That is what makes it under consideration. For the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, the men of the Great Assembly, that were the ones that canonized the Tanach. Right, they were looking only at prophecies that have a relevance to all generations. And this makes perfect sense because Torah is supposed to be eternally relevant. It's, as the Rambam writes in a few places, the Torah describes itself as Morasha Kehilas Yaakov. It is inheritance onto the assembly of Yaakov, which is the Jewish people. Inheritance, Yerusha Ein La Hefsek. Inheritance never stops. It just gets handed over to next. It's and that's one of the Rambam's proofs that Torah is eternal and unchanging. So it makes very good sense that only a prophecy that had relevance for all generations. So even if the prophet was talking about the Jewish people of his time and the other nations of the world of his time, but if the message, the moral message, is one that's relevant for all times, that's what makes the basic bar to be under consideration of being included in the Tanach, and it becomes part of the written law. It has to be a message relevant for all generations. So even if the prophet is talking to the Jewish people of his time, and he's talking about it in the historical context of whatever nations, and he is prophesizing on whatever nations that there are at his time of how they're going to get it, but since what we can learn from it is timeless truths, that's why it makes it, the basic bar to be under consideration to be included in the Tanach. So you had plenty of prophets, but not all the prophets merited to have prophecies that have a message relevant to all generations, right? Needed by all generations, the literal words. Okay. So now, having cleared that up, let's get back into these three major components that make up the Torah Shebechsav, the Tanach, Torah, Nevi'im, Kesuvim. Now, Torah is the special term, not just for the Torah in general, but the special term for the 5 books of Moshe, the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, as they're called. So that's amazing, right? That, these 5 are called Torah per se, right? Even though we're talking about the whole Torah Shebechsav. When I learn Yehoshua, when I learn Yeshayahu, I'm learning Torah Shebechsav, the written Torah. But these 5 books of Moshe are called Torah per se, as opposed to anything else, which is called Nevi'im and Kesuvim. And we're going to go into this now. And like I always remind you guys out there in the audience, we are Rambam-centric on this. So there may be other opinions, but the Rambam laid it out the most clearly for us, and the Rambam's definitely an authority you could rely on. So to understand, and it's all in the name already, that Moshe's book, 5 books of Moshe, are called Torah per se. So I guess even though we are Rambam-centric, we will speak out the Shita of Rashi in Kiddushin, I believe is on Daf Lamed, that your obligation to learn written law is only Chumash. You're not obligated to learn Nevi'im and Kesuvim, right? And our obligation to learn the entirety of Torah, the Rambam indeed holds that for the time being, and what I mean by that we'll get back to later in this session. For the time being, you have to learn the entirety of Tanach, just like you have to learn the entirety of the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law. Not according to Rashi. According to Rashi, only Chumash. Right? But even though, we may paskin like the Rambam, that all of Tanach is included in your obligation to learn the written law, right, the Torah Shebechsav. Right, still, why the 5 books of Moshe are called Torah per se is for a few reasons that we're about to outline. Right? But all the few reasons come from the same root. Moshe's, as one of our principles of faith, that Moshe Rabbeinu's level of prophecy is unparalleled by any other prophet. Right? He is the supreme prophet. There'll never be another prophet as great as Moshe. And even Mashiach will not be as big of a prophet as Moshe. Will be close, says the Rambam, but not the same. Moshe is forever the supreme prophet. And the Rambam further explains in a few places, particularly the Moreh Nevuchim, from Moshe's level of prophecy alone comes the Torah per se. Okay. Now, what do we mean by that? This goes back to something we said 2 installments ago by the very first video that we dropped in this series, that even a guy has to keep his 7 mitzvahs because Moshe said. Moshe is the one channel for the absolute truth of Torah. So here's an amazing halacha, right? Of lo bashamayim hi. Torah is not in heaven. So a prophet comes along and he passes our criteria, of how we test him to certify him as a prophet. And then he says, God told me that this is the halacha, right? So, so lo mi bias, we say in Gemara talk. It is so simple that if he's contradicting Moshe's Torah by either adding or detracting from it, he's obviously a false prophet. We'd kill him on the spot for false prophecy. And that's Ela mitzvahs ein navi shashla. These are the mitzvahs. It says in the Chumash that Moshe wrote, by word of God. These are the mitzvahs. These and none others, not more, not less. A prophet cannot add or detract. Right? But that's Ela mitzvahs. That teaches you he can't tamper. Even if he's he passed credentials being a prophet. We say, well, over here he's bluffing. Maybe he passed the clearance, but either he bluffed this all the way through or he just went bad. Now, either way, he cannot contradict Moshe and add or detract from the mitzvahs, right? But it goes further than that. Again, we're in Rambam land, so please do not confuse me with facts that you may have seen in other books. The Rambam, very unequivocal in all his writings, particularly in Hilchos Yesodei Torah, when he has all the laws of prophecy, from chapter 7 through 10 in Hilchos Yesodei Torah, says, even though he's not coming to add or detract, but let's say we have an area of doubt. How do we paskin? How should we rule on this? The prophet says, good thing. Last night God came to a dream and told me the halacha is like Rashi and not like Rabbeinu Tam in Tefillin. Kill him on the spot. That's the additional halacha of lo bashamayim hi. Right? Torah is not in heaven, that once Moshe brought it to earth, all issues of doubt have to be resolved here on earth and through the earthly process of, bringing proofs, bringing counter-proofs, using the droshos, which we'll discuss later in this series. Right? And in the words of the Rambam in his introduction to Zroim, in his introduction to his commentary to the Mishnah, from after Moshe, Yoshua and Pinchas, who lived during the time of Moshe and carried on after him, they do the same thing as Ravina and Ravashi. They may not employ prophecy to settle a doubt, right, or even to say if there's a machlokas, that looks like him and not like that, right? They're not allowed to use prophecy to intervene in halacha. Moshe is the exception to that. Moshe's prophecy gave us the law, right? But only his level of prophecy, as Ram says, the Rambam ties doesn't say these are not two disjointed facts. He happens to have been the supreme prophet, and he happens to have been the lawgiver, and the only one that's endorsed to teach us Torah that he claims to have gotten through prophecy. Right? He says he got it, not claim. I mean, he says he got it. We believe him, right? It's not two disjointed facts. They're actually linked. He is the supreme prophet, and his level of prophecy is Torah. And that's why we can learn from the Chumash halacha. There's a lot of mitzvahs that are spelled out in the Chumash. Still, there's always more details in the Torah Shebaal Peh. So Shemitah is a prime example of something that was rather spelled out, relatively speaking, to many other mitzvahs, and still these are Torah Shebaal Peh. But nonetheless, we can open up a Chumash and learn Torah from it, including halacha. Right? And Moshe is the only prophet that we were allowed, to accept Torah as, I said, how do you know? God told me. Okay, Moshe is the only prophet ever in history that was allowed to say that, right? And it goes, and it's like I said, it's one with the idea that his supreme level of prophecy is the level of Torah. And this something which will come up in other series that we have over here. I don't want to dwell on this part that that his being the supreme prophet and being the lawgiver and the one that could tell us in the name of God, the only one in history that could tell us in the name of God what the law is. Now, those are not two disjointed facts; they are integrally linked because his level of prophecy is the Torah. Okay, so we can learn halacha from the Chumash, and also in the oral law, there's something called halacha l'Moshe miSinai, which we're going to discuss in the continuation of this series. Moshe says, "Listen, this is the law because God told me, and from Moshe we'll take it. We won't take it from any other prophet after him, and from no prophet before him either." And that's what we said in the very first installment of this series. Right, even a goy has to use Moshe and the Chumash as his source for the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, and we refer back there. Okay, so that's already one reason. It's already self-evident why his book is called Torah per se. Right, he's the only one that's the only book that we can learn halacha from as a primary source. So now, in continuation, another branch of this is what we'll find in many places in Shas. Divrei halacha mi divrei kabbalah lo yalfinan. Right, so we call regular prophecy from anyone other than Moshe, divrei kabbalah. Right, we received it because he received the prophecy and we received it from him. So it's received knowledge, right? And that's called divrei kabbalah. And we don't learn halacha from them, So let's say I see something in the book of Yoshua or in the book of Ruth, right, which teaches me, from there I could learn halacha. No, from there, you cannot use as a primary source for halacha if there is no source that predates it in Torah, which either is in the Chumash or in the oral law. Right? If there's no earlier source for it, and this statement in the prophet is the only source for this halacha, we can't adopt it as biblical law. I stress we're in Rambam land over here. The Ramban has a slightly different shita. It's complicated, and it's in his Hasagas on the Shoresh Harishon, right? And I don't want to take responsibility. And in this program, we want to bring clarity, not confusion. We're sticking with the Rambam on this. Okay? We're sticking with the Rambam on this and his interpretations of these statements of Chazal. Okay, so so let's say we find something in the prophets. I'll give you an example. One of the prophets, I can't remember if it's Yirmiyahu. The source is not important, but it's Al Tisu Masa B'Yom Shabbos. Don't carry on Shabbos. That's the only place that you will see the prohibition of carrying on Shabbos in the written law, in the Tanach, right? That is not the source that it's prohibited to carry on Shabbos. It's a Hilchsa Gemiri law. I mean, carrying 4 Amos and Rosh Hashanah is halacha l'Moshe Misinai, right? And there is a vague allusion to it also in the Chumash of Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, that form of Hotzah. So we say the prophet just wrote out what we knew already. Okay, so let's be very careful about this, right? From Sefer Rus, right? Kesuvim, right? So that's where we see the source for the Kinyan Chalipin. Right, that Boaz bought the field off of Ploni Almoni, instead of Ploni Almoni, I should say, with a Kinyan Chalipin, right? Instead of Ploni Almoni, with a Kinyan Chalipin. So now, either, and it says also Fimi, so this was a tradition in Israel. So what's written of there is just a historical record. That means they had Kinyan Chalipin before, as is evident from the pasuk itself. So even though we might point to that pasuk as a source, we don't mean literally source as point of origin, that if not for that pasuk, there would be no Kinyan Chalipin. It is bearing testimony to Kinyan Chalipin, which part of that point was part of the oral tradition, right? It's also Fnim Yisrael, Agula V'al Tamura. Right? At least that's one way to understand it. Okay. In the event that a statement in the prophets would be the primary source for a halacha or a good practice, right, that has no source in Chumash or in the oral tradition, right, that would be the only source, and it's not coming as a testimonial as to what was always done, which would indicate that it's already sourced, it already has its legal sourcing, its legal point of origin earlier. Right? That's like because the prophet said, and therefore that is the halacha. According to Rambam, it only has the status of a d'Rabbanan. So we say the prophet instituted it, but the prophet is not licensed to add or detract or have any bearing on biblical law with the power of his prophecy. Right? That's divrei halacha, but divrei kabbalah. We do not learn halacha from nevuah, which include what's written in the scriptures, in any book other than Moshe's. But Moshe's book is called divrei halacha, right? That's why it's called Torah per se. Right? It's the one book. He was the one prophet that could use prophecy to teach us the law. He taught us the law through his prophecy, and his book is the one book that it's a primary source for halacha. Like I said, the books of Nevi'im are either historically chronicling something, or right, and that's what we use it for. But we will now work feverishly to derive what must have been its source earlier, either in the Chumash or the oral tradition, and the Nevi'im is just a testimonial to something that was known through Moshe, through the oral tradition, right? Either or. Another way we use the Nevi'im, all books other than the Chumash, is for what's called Gilui Milsa Ba'alma, right? Just to use it as a dictionary. Okay, now the Gemara in Baba Kama, at the very beginning, Keren, Gemara wants to send, horns, right? That if an ox scores with the horns, the owner of the ox is liable to pay. Right? So now, question, horns just means the horns that grow out naturally. What if the animal picks up with its teeth a detached pair of horns and goes on a rampage that way? So the Gemara brings a proof from a pasuk in Navi, right? That the Torah says you got to pay if you're sure, if your ox scores. So the Pasuk Navi, it says, Tzidkiel ben Canaan made like a model pair of horns and said, Sibagi, with these you will gore the nation of Aram. Right? Tzidkiel ben Canaan was a false prophet, but we are using the pasuk in Navi as the Gemara says, it's Gilui Milsa Ba'alma. Right? It could be used as just as a dictionary, to teach us Hebrew. Right? So we use it as a dictionary. We see that even detached horns are also called tagor. If you use detached horns as a weapon, and ergo, if my ox takes a piece of detached horns into its mouth and goes on a rampage that way and gores people with the detail, from that pasuk we see it's also called tagor. And the Torah said if your ox scores, you got to pay. All right. And by the way, the Gemara over there also references, the idea of divrei halacha b'divrei kabbalah. And just says, well, this might be different. It's gilui mil sabam. We could use the Nevi'im XLerate as a dictionary. That from there we'll see. Hey, you see from how the pasuk uses this word, that this word means such. Okay, now we could re-examine the Chumash. Go back to the Chumash based on what we learned about Hebrew from the Nevi'im and Kesuvim, and reinterpret the Chumash that way. But again, it always goes back to the Chumash or the oral tradition. The oral transmission will have to be the primary source of halacha for it to be considered biblical. Okay. So now, let's just give another example that the Rambam criticized the Bahag for counting, clothing, the people that need clothes, and feeding the hungry and bringing in the homeless as separate mitzvahs, right? And the Ram says, hey, if these things are in the prophets, the prophet cannot add new mitzvahs, right? That's why the Bahag counted them, because he saw it in the words of the prophets. Okay. So like I said, we are sticking with the Rambam on this. All right. So the Rambam criticized the prophet is not, he can't make new mitzvahs, and they're not new mitzvahs. The prophet is just saying in detail everything that is implicit in what's already written in the Chumash of V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your neighbor like yourself. So of course you would want yourself to be clothed. If you need clothes, clothe your neighbor. Right? You want to, you don't want to be homeless, right? So just like you don't want to be homeless, help the homeless, right? You don't want to be hungry, help the hungry. All right, so the prophet was spelling things out, but the legal sources, all the single verse in the Chumash of V'ahavta Kamocha, and these are therefore should not be counted as separate mitzvahs of the Torah. There's one mitzvah in the Torah, what's written in the Chumash of V'ahavta Kamocha, which includes all those things that the prophet decided to speak out. Okay, but should there be like something new that the prophet is the only source, right? So we say it's the prophet is instituting it with the same authority as the rabbis have to institute new law, but it's rabbinic law. It's not biblical law. Biblical law we can't touch. We can't add or detract from biblical law. Even prophets cannot add or detract from biblical law. But the prophets are no less than the rabbis. That if the prophet had a Sanhedrin, and the prophet convened the Sanhedrin, and he legislated this. So it's like muktzah that the rabbis outlawed us moving certain objects on Shabbos, actually most objects, right? But we're not, we'll get to the laws of muktzah in our series on the laws of Shabbos. We'll have klali muktzah, an orientation that should suffice for the laws of muktzah, but it's rabbinic, right? For whatever reasons, the rabbis, and that's okay as long as they're open about it, that this is not biblical law, this is our thing. The prophet is not less than any other rabbi. The Nevi'im weren't less than any Sanhedrin. So they have the authority as rabbis to, institute the Rabbanans. So if we find something, according to the Rambam, this is in the Rambam land, if we find something in the Nevi'im that is not a testimony to what always was, and it's not Gili Milsvan, it's not just helping us understand the Hebrew, and therefore once we understand the Hebrew this way, we go back to the Chumash and find it there. It's the only source, and it's not implicit in anything that we find in the Chumash or in the Torah Shebaal Peh, in the oral tradition, in the oral explanation. It's a D'Rabbanan. It's just very interesting that the Rambam always is in favor of pointing out that it's midivrei Nevi'im in a lot, like by Megillah, we mentioned yesterday, in the last installment of this series, that Esther had a whole fight with the Anshe Knesset Agdola. She was still living in the era of the prophets. She wanted the Megillah Esther to be part of the Tanach. It's not Nevi'im, it's Kesuvim, but still part of the Tanach. So he says, Aram, let's say, he says by Megillah, and you should know that that Megillah, it's midivrei Sofrim, but it's more that it's from the prophets. Now that has some type of, obviously not as far as I can tell in the Rambam, it doesn't make a legal difference. There are those who hold that if it's the Takana Nevi'im, it should be treated with greater stringency. There are people who actually hold that. I don't have any indication in the Rambam that that is the case, but he does consider it, as it were, of some great philosophical significance, that it is a takonas hanavim, even though the legal ability of the Navi to make us do this is the same like the authority granted to the rabbis, the lo sasur. I do not deviate from what I tell you, which includes, the mitzvahs that they invent for you. All right, so to sum it up, only the book of Moshe, his level of prophecy, and hence the book written by that level of prophecy, is Torah per se. It's called Torah per se. It is a primary source for halacha, right? And Moshe is the only prophet in history, not the prophets before, remember, that was licensed to, give the law, be a source for the law. Right, because as I said, even the Bnei Noach have to keep their 7 mitzvahs because Moshe said. And then we dealt with this in the very first series. So that's one explanation of why his book is called Torah per se. Right, it is a primary source for Jewish law, no less than the oral transmission, and the Nevi'im and Kesuvim cannot be used as primary sources for biblical law. If they are a primary source, it would only be for rabbinic law. If it primary source, there's no other way to trace it back, right, to be implicit in the Chumash or in the Torah Sheba'al Peh. If there's only trace it back, either because it was a testimonial or because it was Gilui Milsa Ba'alma, then it is rabbinic. And a prophet who says anything regarding biblical law because God told him, you kill him on the spot, right? And by the way, any issue of halacha, if a prophet comes and says, God told me to institute muksa, no, we'd kill him for that also. Because that's also part of the halacha of lo b'shamayim. Moshe is the only prophet that's allowed to, was licensed to tell us halacha, right, by word of God. And the other prophet's not allowed to employ his prophecy in changing the Torah, make deciding doubts in Torah, or even in interpreting the Torah. Even in interpreting the Torah, right? We'll accept what a prophet says. If God told me it's the interpretation, we're not going to accept it based on that. We'll accept it because it works. It seems to explain the issue that we're in doubt of, like what we'd accept any reasonable explanation. But if he starts saying halacha based on prophecy in any way, shape, or form, lo b'shamayim. Right. But, the prophets have the same authority as the rabbis to legislate, and we list them as, because of their legislation, they have the same legislative ability as they were the rabbis of the generation, if they convened the Sanhedrin and legislated. Right. That is the way I understand it, according to the Rambam. Okay. So now we move on. Nevi'im and Kesuvim. What is their function? So they don't teach us halacha. We use them as clues, sometimes for our testimonials of what must have been Jewish practice. We use them as clues for what certain Hebrew words mean, right? And if there's something that they tell us to do that, for all time, that has no other source, we say they legislated it. They legislated it, right? Okay, they were the Rabbanan of that generation. It's part of their authorities as members of the Sanhedrin, which for some reason, the fact that they were prophets gives it some greater philosophical value, but not a greater legal weight, as far as I can tell in the Rambam. Happy to be corrected if I'm wrong on that. All right, but we move on. And I say, so what is the function of Nevi'im and Kesuvim? What do we need them for if the Torah of Moshe is complete? Between the Chumash and the Torah Shebaal Peh, we got it all. So what do we need Nevi'im and Kesuvim for? So there's only a partial answer because we're going to come to Megillas Esther. That really is an interesting thing, right? Having mentioned Megillas Esther already a few times, yeah. But what is the function of Nevi'im and Kesuvim, right? If all of halacha is really contained within the Chumash and the Torah Shebaal Peh. So now the Gemara says in Nedarim and in other places that if we would have not sinned, Tanach would have been even smaller than it is now, even though we've had millions of prophets, right? But we wouldn't have even needed all those prophecies that are relevant to all times. But what it's in those prophecies are relevant for all times. Musar, that's really rebuke. The prophets are going to scream at us and tell us to keep the Torah. Like everyone knows, thou shalt not steal, right? But you could hear, to have it penetrate, you got to be busted. You got to hear the lecture from your parents 100 times. And if God forbid you succumb, you got to hear the lecture from the cop and hear the lecture from the judge. And then it penetrates. God sent the prophets, to set us straight. If we would have not sinned, let's say we would have kept the straight and narrow, because the law is the law and we don't break the law. You know how big Tanach would have been? 6 books. 6 books, that's it. The 5 books of Moshe and the book of Yehoshua, because of the value of Eretz Yisrael and how to divide it up. Because it's all the book about, Israel and how it's to be apportioned amongst the tribes. That's it. The whole Tanakh would have been Moshe, and Moshe's book, the 5 books of Moshe and Yoshua. But it's Rov Chochmah Neged Rov Kah, more wisdom because of all the anger and turmoil, that the Yetzer Hara had, the effect that the Yetzer Hara has on it, which is called, generally speaking, anger. Because when you're angry, you're off your A game and you're not thinking, and you do a lot of things that you regret. Anger is like one of the biggest evils and the greatest causation of all different types of sins, well, not just sins that are anger related. So Rov Chochmah is an antidote of Rov Kas, that a lot of wisdom that could have left in a code form or in general form has to be spelled out and doubled down on and tripled down on because we were sinning. So God sent us the prophets with this rebuke and to just and of course, once we're being rebuked, so things, details that are all implicit, and encoded in the Chumash get spelled out, right? But it's all just to spell out the details. Like the example we mentioned before, the Navi says, clothe the clothless, shelter the homeless, right? Feed the hungry, right? All those things, right? They should not be counted as new mitzvahs. So where are they in the Chumash? It's all v'aftarecha kamocha. It's all implicit there. It's all contained there, right? It's all contained there. So, so once the prophets rebuke us and we weren't being nice to our fellow man, he rebukes us in details, in detail, right? So now, be nice to your fellow man and give him clothes if he needs clothes and give him shelter if he needs shelter, give him food if he needs food. So once we're being rebuked, we're rebuked in detail, right? Because once we didn't get the message in its wholesome form, in its whole generalized form, which was inclusive of all details, so just like we're not keeping the whole, we're certainly not keeping the details, so we need to be rebuked down to the details. That is the function of Nevi'im and Kesuvim. It is, so they're not coming to add to the Torah, they are not coming to change the Torah. And they're certainly not going to detract from the Torah. They're going to set us on the straight and narrow. And once they're, doubling down on what it already says in the Chumash, since we didn't get the memo, if we didn't get the memo on the general things that are black on white, we certainly didn't get the memo on what's encoded within the black and white. Say, spell it out also. But that's the essence of it. The essence of the Nevi'im and Kesuvim, right, is Musar, is right, rebuke, right, being chastised and being warned and, telling us to do tshuva. And then once they're doubling down on what we forgot, Well, so if we forgot even the general ideas, we certainly forgot the details that are encoded in those general ideas, and that's what the prophets do. And of course, but still, Chazal were not every prophet sent to rebuke us, got his prophecies into the written law, like we said at the beginning of today's session. Only when it was time, like, oh, this is good rebuke. That's every generation can use this message. So that's what qualifies to make it in there. Okay. So indeed, so even though we paskin like the Rambam, you can certainly appreciate what Rashi was saying. We mentioned the Rashi in Kiddushin, that your obligation to learn the Torah Shasav, the written law, is only Chumash, right? It's really the primary source of halach. Everything else is just coming to rebuke us to keep what's in the Chumash and what's encoded and alluded to in the Chumash, that once they're rebuking you, they'll also rebuke you in detail, right? But, we don't paskin that way. We paskin like the Rambam. We have to learn all Tanach, right? But still, that's the function of Tanach. The function of, not Tanach, Nach, Nevi'im and Kesuvim. The function of Kesuvim is Musar, and we need the Musar. So let's put it this way. We need the Musar, and that's the function of learning Nevi'im and Kesuvim. So I once asked my Rosh of Yaakov Weinberg, and I asked him, I made the big mistake of asking him in the middle of Shir Kloli, if the whole function of Nevi'im is Musar. So how about I write an unbelievable Musar book, right? Like, let's say the Mesilas Yesharim is a great Musar book, right? And so what do I need to learn? Shoftim, Shmuel. Yoshua, we said, is an exception because it has to do with Israel, the land of Israel per se. All right, so Yoshua, after Yoshua, I meant to say, from after Yoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malachim, Yeshayahu, Yecheskel. So he gave me a look that suffers fools gladly and said, do you think any person just working with mortal intelligence, genius as he is like the Ramchal, or even, he said, Hillel HaZakeh, who wasn't the prophet, can anyone do a better job than a prophet? That is augmented by the divine spirit. No one can do a better job than the prophet, especially as we're going to get into. Nevi'im are saying the word of God, as opposed to Kesuvim. And we'll discuss that in a second. Who could do better than that? He made me feel like a moron, and it was a moronic question. Because it's only Musar, but no one gives Musar better than Nevi'im, and it's really wrong. I'm speaking to myself right now, that we neglect learning in Nevi'im. We should be getting, we just mentioned yesterday that we get inspiration from the prophets, that there's just like they saw what they say in the book. They say what they saw what they write in the book. When we read it, we also get a little taste of the prophecy, a little bit of prophetic experience, which is what the Rosh Yeshiva meant. So no one could give it to you a message that penetrates your bones better than a prophet. No. So there is no Musar Sefer that could make the prophets unnecessary, superfluous, right? So long as we need Musar, because there's a Yetzer Hara in the world. Okay. So now let's get down to the difference between Nevi'im and Kesuvim, right? Nevi'im is clearly word of God. Now here's an interesting thing. You might think that it's the one God, it's the same one God that spoke to Moshe, spoke to Yoshua, spoke to Shmuel, spoke to Yeshayahu, spoke to Yirmiyahu, and spoke to Yecheskel. All the same one God, but all those books are in very different literary styles. Every book of the prophet has its own literary style. So Chazal were mindful of this, and not only were they didn't just take note of the phenomenon, they made it a halacha. Ein shnei neviim misnabnin besignon echad. No two prophets will prophesize in the same style. And that's how Yehoshaphat knew, right? I believe it was Yehoshaphat, that when the fake prophets were saying Ale Vatzlach, like a whole bunch of guys together, they were all fake because they were all saying exactly the same thing. God does not talk the same way to two prophets. So not only is it Chazal admit to the phenomenon, they made a halacha that it's very suspicious if another prophet will, be imitating Yeshayahu's style to a T. Like if this Navi, two Nevi'im are like two different people. giving the same prophecy verbatim, no difference in style, you have to suspect that one or both are lying. That's how true it is. So it's not just, it's not a mystery we have to deal with. It's a halacha. Ancient Nevi'im misnabdim b'signon echad. So, so now what is the explanation for that? So there's two schools of thought. We'll go with the Ramchal. That, other than Moshe, that God, that's as it were, God's own style is how it is written in the Chumash. That's not Moshe's style. That's God's style. Because Moshe totally annulled himself to be a unfiltered vessel to receive the pure Torah, right? But all other prophets who are not on that level, God speaks to them through the filter of their personality. Indeed, they're not filterless like Moshe was. Moshe broke every single filter, in the words of the Rambam. Right? Again, that's his prime level, which makes him on the level. His prophecy is the level of Torah. All the other prophets are beneath that, and they have the filter of their personality. And God works with that filter and speaks to them in their natural style, because he speaks to them through the filter of their personality. That's the Ramchal. There are those that take it further and say that, of course, the communication is complete and clear, but the prophet is allowed to choose his own words to convey it to the people and to write it in the scroll. And that's why everyone has their own style. It's a very small difference. But we'll go with the Ramchal, because it's what I'm accustomed to. It's Ramchal. Because we said, right, this series is Rambam-centric and Ramchal-centric, who was also a very systematic person. And that's what he writes in the book that we're going to do in this next year, of the Derech Hashem. That's how he says it. And they have filters, the filters of their personality that they didn't annul. Moshe was Anav Mikol Isha. He was like the greatest, most humble person. He was totally annulled his personal filters. He had no filters. He could receive the pure word of God. So he's the only one who could write the book that could be a primary source for the law. And he is the only prophet that's a primary source for the law, like we've said already a few times. Now, the other prophets are on a low level, and they have a personality that God has to work with, and so he speaks to them in their natural style. We're going to say like the Ramchal, but I'll just say again, there are those that take it further and say, again, the communication is solid. The prophet understands exactly what he saw, but he's allowed to choose his own words, and that's why every prophet has his own style. But look how this phenomenon, okay, but look how this phenomenon is, so much halacha, ancient of no two prophets speak in the same way. All right, we've already gone over time because, we try to keep this down to 40 minutes. So we're going to have yet another session on this topic. Everyone have a good day and keep on checking our site for more XLerate lessons as they drop. Kol Tov, have a good day, everyone.